Statement. Minister.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Madam Deputy Speaker, as I know Right Honourable and Honourable members across the House will agree, Jeffrey Epstein was a despicable criminal who committed disgusting crimes and destroyed the lives of countless women and girls. What he did is unforgivable. His victims must be our first priority. As the Prime Minister has said, anybody with relevant information must come forward and cooperate with investigations so that Jeffrey Epstein's victims can get the justice they have been denied for too long. Madam Deputy Speaker, on Friday, the Department of Justice in the United States released around 3 million pages from the case files relating to Jeffrey Epstein. It is increasingly clear that his awful crimes involved and were facilitated by many, often powerful people, both by actively participating in those crimes, but also by failing to hear those victims' voices, by equating wealth with integrity, and by not using one's privileged position to speak out, even against a friend. It is incumbent upon those of us who hold ministerial office to behave in such a way that builds trust in politics and upholds the standards that voters rightly expect from us. Contained within the release by the US Department of Justice were documents which highlighted the close nature of the relationship between Jeffrey Epstein and Peter Mandlesson, including alleged financial transactions when Peter Mandlesson was a Labour Member of Parliament and later Minister. For the avoidance of doubt, this information was not known by the government until the release of documents by the Department of Justice on Friday. The nature of the documents also raised serious concerns about Peter Mandelson's behaviour whilst a minister. Peter Mandlesson must account for his actions and conduct. It is an understatement, Madam Deputy Speaker, to say that his decision to continue a close relationship with a convicted paedophile, including discussing private government business, falls far below the standards expected of any minister. His behaviour was unequivocally wrong and an insult to the women and girls who suffered. No government minister of any political party should have, nor ever should, behave in this way. Madam Deputy Speaker, the Prime Minister has today asked the Cabinet Secretary to review all available information regarding Peter Mandelson's contact with Jeffrey Epstein during his period as a government minister and to report back to him as a matter of urgency. As the House knows, Peter Mandlesson is no longer a member of the Labour Party, having resigned his membership last night, and the House may wish to know that disciplinary action was underway by the Labour Party prior to his resignation. The Prime Minister believes, as does the government, that Peter Mandelsson should not retain his membership of the House of Lords or use his title. As the House already knows, the government does not have the power to remove peerages without legislation. However, the Prime Minister is calling on all political parties, including the Conservatives as the largest party in the House of Lords, to work with the government to modernise the disciplinary procedures to allow for removal of peers who have brought the House of Lords into disrepute. The government will today write to the appropriate authorities in the other place to start that process. It would be better, Madam Deputy Speaker, to update those procedures so that they apply to all members of the House of Lords, instead of having to introduce complex hybrid bills for each individual peer who has brought the other place into disrepute. Madam Deputy Speaker, I recognise the strength of feeling on all sides of the House, myself included, and the Government will of course keep members up to date. I commend the statement to the House.
I call the Shadow Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I'd like to thank the Minister for advance sight of his statement. The crimes of Jeffrey Epstein were truly terrible. Paedophilia, sex trafficking, child prostitution. It was an awful abuse of power. And it is, of course, a great embarrassment to our country that its most senior ambassador should have been caught up with a man like him. In this latest set of releases from the US Department of Justice, it's clearer than ever that theirs was a relationship built not just on affection, but on the transfer of money from Epstein to Mandelson's family, and the transfer of information from Mandelson to Epstein. In some cases, this was apparently market-sensitive information that Mandelson only received by dint of being a member of the Labour government. So, of course, we welcome the belated announcement that there will be an investigation into Mandelson's conduct whilst he was a minister. But this should have happened long ago, and I say that because we know that in February last year, Gordon Brown, the former Prime Minister, wrote to the Cabinet Secretary explicitly asking for an investigation into the veracity of information contained in the Epstein papers about the sale of assets arising from the banking collapse and communications about them between Lord Mandelsson and Mr. Epstein. That investigation never happened. In any case, I'm afraid the investigation announced today alone will not do. It is not enough to consider Mandelson's historic conduct. There also needs to be an investigation into his behaviour whilst he was our ambassador in Washington. Given that he abused his previous position, it is entirely conceivable that he abused his most recent one. For example, I understand that on the 27th of February last year, Mandelson arranged for the Prime Minister to meet Palantir, a client of Mandelson's company, Global Counsel. How many more such meetings were there? What other information was shared? We all have a right to know. Likewise, the government cannot hide from its responsibility in having made Mandelson its ambassador in the first place. This was a political appointment. It happened only because of political pressure. And so one of two things must be true, Madam Deputy Speaker. Either there was the most terrible failure of the vetting system, or the government chose to brush that vetting information away. And both are very serious. But the government must now be honest with us about which it was. And it seems very unlikely that the government's vetting system broke down entirely. Indeed, on the 10th of September, the Prime Minister told the House that full due process was followed during this appointment. Can it really be the case that this full due process did not pick up the extent of the relationship? On the 3rd of November, Ollie Robbins, the then Permanent Secretary at the Foreign Office, told committee, back before Lord Mandelson was announced as the appointee, there was a process within the Cabinet Office to make sure that the Prime Minister was aware of Lord Mandelson and the issues around his appointment. We can confidently say that the relationship with Epstein was indeed surfaced. So the government knew that Mandelson had a long-maintained and unhealthy relationship with Epstein, and yet it continued with its appointment anyway. So the question is, Madam Deputy Speaker, who in number 10 knew what and when? And the Chief Secretary to the Prime Minister has a duty to tell this House precisely what the Prime Minister knew when he made the appointment, to disclose the documents that the Prime Minister saw. And if the Prime Minister genuinely did not know, well, somebody must have done. Who was it? Was it his Chief of Staff, Morgan McSweeney, who is reported to have personally pushed the appointment? Was it the Deputy Prime Minister, who was then the Foreign Secretary, who would have been party to some of the information? It's just time for the government to be open and clear with us all. Something went very badly wrong with this appointment, Madam Deputy Speaker. It has caused very great embarrassment to this country, and it is time that someone took responsibility.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The person that has to take responsibility for their failings is Peter Mandlesson. The Shadow Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster knows, because the process for political appointments, whether to ambassadorships or otherwise, was one that was set up under the previous Conservative government. It was a process that we inherited and have since updated. The Prime Minister has been very clear that the declarations of interest that were put forward by Peter Mandelson were not wholly truthful. When it became clear from the release of information that had not been the case, the Prime Minister moved swiftly to remove Peter Mandelson as the ambassador to the United States.